From cold-blooded strategists to unpredictable maniacs, the stories you're about to see unravel the darkest corners of Asia's most twisted criminal minds. Witness the journeys that led them down the path of infamy, the ingenious methods behind their madness, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Brace yourself for a chilling exploration of Asia's most notorious killers. This is Asian Crime Chronicles.
When we hear the word psychopath, the names of famous serial killers and mass murderers appear in our minds. Somebody who revels in the pain and misery of others, unable to empathize with the pain and suffering they're inflicting. I'm sure we can all come up with an example. However, today I would like to share the story of one psychopathic serial killer that lurks in the depths of my mind. Futoshi Matsunaga, otherwise known as Japan's mind control killer. Ever since he was a child, he had stood out from his peers. Good-looking, smart, and extremely charismatic. Born on April 28, 1961, in a relatively wealthy family, his mother and grandmother adored Futoshi. Aside from his charming personality, he was a good student as well, gathering top scores in all his classes, leading a student organization, and being class president. But there was another side to Futoshi. While he was getting good grades, he was often caught lying and misrepresenting facts. This caused his teachers to lose trust in him. Eventually, he was transferred to another school after being caught in a relationship with one of the girls attending. Futoshi graduated high school and got married to X at the age of 19 and had a son. He had inherited his father's shop and turned it into a futon business. While running it, Futoshi's name started popping up in several scams and criminal offenses. During Futoshi's marriage, there were reports of him having at least 10 mistresses. One of them was Junko Ogata, whom he had gone to school with. Junko Ogata was born on February 25, 1962, and was a classmate to Futoshi. They weren't close friends, but they had seen each other around before Futoshi had been transferred. After graduating, she got a job as a teacher in a preschool. Junko was described as caring and gentle, but that all changed after reconnecting with Futoshi in 1982. Junko's mother was firmly against the relationship, claiming that her daughter was being abused. So it was no surprise when she objected to the couple getting married in 1984. In response, Futoshi visited the mother and raped her. When he returned to Junko, he convinced her to run away with him. Futoshi explained how Junko's family hated her because of a suicide attempt in 1985, and that it would be best for their relationship if they moved away. While Junko had been a virgin during the start of their relationship, Futoshi accused her of sleeping with other men, which led to Junko having to endure severe abuse. His jealous nature appeared during these incidents. However, Junko stayed with him and eventually gave birth to 2 sons. While Futoshi ran his futon business, reports of him abusing employees by giving them electric shocks and yelling deranged and nonsensical things at them. Using this business as a front, he had managed to blackmail people out of 180 million yen. The couple managed to stay under the police's radar and went on the run as they were added to Japan's most wanted list. But this didn't stop Futoshi. In April 1993, he met his first victim, a married woman with 3 children. Futoshi had convinced the woman to leave her husband and run away with him. Junko? She was his sister. The woman believed him and agreed. In September 1993, one of the children was found to have died under mysterious circumstances. The other 2 children were sent to live with their father, and the remaining family just a month later. The woman had realized that she wasn't living the life she had been promised, and did what she could to keep her children safe. During the woman's relationship with Futoshi, she lost 11.8 million yen to him. What exactly happened during their relationship remains unknown to this day. However, her body was found on March 1994. An investigation ensued, but there was no evidence to tie Futoshi to her death or the death of her child. But Futoshi wasn't done there. He had found his next victim in Kumio Toraya and his daughter. In the 2 years that followed, Futoshi abused Kumio, blackmailing the victim with his previous convictions and going so far as to make him confess to crimes he hadn't committed. Kumio was confined into a single room together with his daughter, who was forced to abuse her father by Futoshi. When Kumio died as a result at the age of 34, Futoshi made the daughter believe that she had killed her father. Junko and the girl were instructed to clean up the remains and dump them to get rid of the evidence, while Futoshi went ahead and found his next victim. The story seemed to repeat itself. He was convinced they would get married, insisting that he was a graduate of a prestigious university in Tokyo. The woman was an acquaintance of Kumio, believed him, and moved in together with her daughter. Futoshi scammed the woman out of 5.6 million yen during their imprisonment in Kumio's apartment. In March 1997, the woman was desperate after endless torture and abuse that she saw no other way of escape than jumping through the window. She fell from 2 stories and was taken to the hospital together with her daughter. Throughout Futoshi's crimes, Junko was present and assisted wherever Futoshi wanted. We're not sure if she was truly so enamored by Futoshi or if he had truly broken her mind into unrelenting obedience. But Futoshi trusted Junko enough to let her leave the apartment. She would go out and buy food and go to work, and every single time, Junko would return without fail. Until one day, in April 1997, she didn't come back to their apartment from work. Futoshi called Junko's family to find out where she was, but Junko's mother, Shizumi, refused to give any sort of answer. Futoshi blackmailed them to find Junko, trying to convince them that their daughter was a murderer and threatening them if they didn't tell him where she was. In truth, Junko had escaped. She had told her family what had happened and how she couldn't hold on any longer. So, when the news arrived that Futoshi had committed suicide and a funeral was being held, Junko believed that it was all over and returned to her family. Futoshi found her there and punished her for her actions. The Ogata family gave Futoshi 63 million yen to keep him away. He took it, but didn't stop. He invaded the house and held them hostage. That was when his psychological games went to another level. Futoshi seduced Junko's sister, Rieko, who lived in the house together with her husband. A combination of torture, sexual abuse, and his words had turned the family into his own personal cult. In late December, Futoshi instructed Junko to torture her father. She was instructed to repeatedly electrocute him until he eventually passed away. He was 61 years old. The constant abuse directed at Shizumi made the mother lose all grip on reality. She had started speaking in strange voices and acted erratically. Eventually, Futoshi instructed Rieko and her husband Kazuya to strangle Shizumi to death. She was 58. Rieko had gone deaf from the abuse she endured at Futoshi's hand, so she was the next victim he wanted to get rid of. Instructing Rieko's daughter, Aya, to hold her mother down, it was Kazuya who strangled her to death. Rieko was 33 years old at the time of her death. After the 2 murders, Kazuya was exhausted and locked up in the bathroom. He survived for 2 months by drinking toilet water, but eventually starved to death at the age of 38. After Kazuya's death in April 1998, only Futoshi, Junko, Kumio's daughter Aya, and her brother Yuki remained alive in the house. In May of that same year, Futoshi instructed Kumio's daughter and Junko to hold Yuki down, while Aya was made to strangle him. The little boy died at just 5 years old. Aya soon followed as Futoshi and Junko electrocuted her together. Although Junko herself denied this during her testimony, she claims that it was Kumio's daughter who killed the little girl, strangling her to death. Aya was 10 years old when she died. After every single murder, the victim was cut up and boiled in pots. During the investigation, neighbors would state that they heard loud noises and smelled a vile scent coming from the apartment at times. After boiling, the remains would be transported and dumped at public washrooms or in the ocean. It was Kumio's daughter, who was still being held captive, that managed to escape. After their first attempt in late January, Futoshi found the girl again in February and brought her back. Her punishment? Electrocution. But that didn't stop the girl, as she escaped again in early March. This time, she immediately contacted the police department to report the crimes. The girl was 17 years old at that point and led the police to Futoshi and Junko's location, where they were arrested the next day. Junko Ogata admitted to all murders in a calm and collected manner. There was no trace left of the caring girl she had been before her relationship with Futoshi. Since there was no physical evidence, the police relied on both Junko and Kumio's daughter's statements. Futoshi insisted that he was innocent. Junko and Futoshi were sentenced to death by hanging after the trial after being pronounced guilty of the 6 murders. During this trial, however, the death of Junko's father wasn't considered murder. They had stated that the man had been tortured with electroshocks and died as a result of his injuries. An appeal was made against this decision. On April 26, 2007, the case went to trial again in high court. This time, Junko's death sentence was reduced to life in prison. Their reason? Junko was forced to commit the murders under the threat that Futoshi would assault her if she didn't comply with his wishes. As for Futoshi Matsunaga, his death sentence remained the same. Kumio's daughter was never tried for the crimes, despite partaking in them. She had still been a child, and was also one of Futoshi's victims, blackmailed into committing atrocious acts. According to various reports, we believe that the girl has moved on with her life. She underwent intense psychological treatment to work through the traumatic experiences. But she is reportedly becoming a positive and bubbly young woman, trying to enjoy the rest of her life. To this day, both Junko and Futoshi remain in prison. Their families have declined to release any comments in regards to the crimes. It is a shadow that will forever remain, and it just goes to show that true psychopaths are those whom we would never suspect upon meeting. This is the story of the bizarre murder of an elderly couple by their son, Junji Matsumoto. Tired of caring for his parents, he allegedly killed and hid them in their fridge. Junji Matsumoto lived in Fukuoka, Japan. In his late 50s, he was unemployed, caring for his parents, and in June 2021, decided to murder his elderly parents. How did he kill them? Why did he decide he had had enough of caring for them? How was he caught, and what happened to him? According to Japanese news, Shinji's parents, 88-year-old father Hirokazu Matsumoto, and his mother, 87-year-old Makie Matsumoto, lived in Fukuoka in the southern part of Japan. The couple had 2 children, of which Junji was the second son. Hirokazu had been a worker in the construction industry before retiring, and Makie ran a liquor shop out of their 2-story house in Japan. Alongside Makie, both her sons helped out at the liquor store. The eldest son was set to take over the shop when the couple retired. However, Japanese media sites reported that due to illness, the older brother was hospitalized 10 years ago. Unable to run the shop, Makie closed it. Whether the shop was closed because the couple decided to retire, Junji not being able to take over the shop, the closing of businesses and restaurants in the area that made it impossible to continue, or some other reason is not known. Possibly a combination of those reasons, as well as the fact that Makie suffered a heart attack and was forced to use a wheelchair, might have aided in the closure of the shop. After her heart attack, Hirokazu was taking care of the household duties at Makie. Unfortunately, on June 13, 2021, Hirokazu had an accident with his bicycle and was also laid up in a wheelchair. This meant that Junji now had the sole burden of taking care of both his sick and elderly parents. With both parents now needing full-time care from Junji, this might have been the reason that eventually pushed him over the edge. Junji Matsumoto, born in 1962 and currently 59 years old, has lived his whole life in Fukuoka at his parents' home. According to interviews with people who knew Junji, he seemed to be a quiet and introverted child who didn't speak much. Even when called upon in the classroom, he would either not respond or say he was feeling unwell. An elementary classmate told a story about students being asked what they wanted to be when they grew up. When it came to his turn to answer, he didn't speak. Later on, I asked him what he wanted to be, and he told me he wanted to be a scientist. He was good at science and math. After graduating from high school, he got a job but quickly quit because he couldn't adjust to the workplace and never went back to work again. It is reported that he was unemployed for the last 40 years, though he had been helping at his mother's liquor shop before it closed, and he was also caring for his parents. A few days before the incident, an acquaintance saw Junji riding his bicycle and greeted him. But Junji ignored him and rode away. Not much is known about Junji except that he lived at home and had no savings. He used money from the pensions and savings of his parents to survive and lived an isolated life at home with them. On June 20th, 2021, Junji was at home, as usual, watching his favorite anime on TV. Since Junji's father's bike accident on the 13th, Junji had been responsible for care duties for both his parents, including meals, cleaning, bathing, and taking them to the bathroom. Witnesses saw him shopping with his mother in the afternoon on the 20th. On this day, Hirokazu kept asking Junji to take him to the bathroom and was angered when his son wouldn't tend to him. According to a local news outlet, Junji said that, "During a good scene in an anime, my father repeatedly called for me to take care of him. Because he complained about me, I killed him." He told police that he used an electrical cord to strangle his father. Once his father was dead, he went to his mother and strangled her as well, because she had witnessed the murder. He then took both of their bodies and placed them in an empty commercial refrigerator on the first floor of their home that used to be part of the liquor shop. The refrigerator was unplugged, and the glass was covered in duct tape to hide the remains. The bodies were stacked on top of each other and were in decay when the police finally found them. The day after killing his parents, on the 21st of June, Junji called the rehab hospital where his mother had an appointment and canceled it, saying she had been hospitalized. Then, on the 23rd of June, he contacted the city welfare office, who was planning to visit that day, and postponed the visit for a day. He was also seen by neighbors riding his bike alone. According to police investigations, Junji stole his parents' bank cards and withdrew thousands of yen from their accounts, and then traveled to Hakata Station, boarding a train that went all the way north to Yamaguchi Prefecture. Moving from prefecture to prefecture, Junji stopped in Akita, Iwate, Kanagawa, all the way to Kyoto. Police were able to track his movements and caught up with him on July 4th in the parking lot of the hotel where he was staying in Kyoto. While on the run, relatives couldn't get in touch with him or his parents, so they had called the police to do a wellness check on June 28th. On this day, police entered the home and noticed a strange odor coming from a commercial fridge that was taped up. Opening the unplugged fridge, they were shocked to find the decaying bodies of Junji's parents. They also couldn't find Junji, so he quickly became a person of interest, and the police started searching for him. FNN News stated that once police found Junji, he quickly admitted to placing his dead parents in the fridge and said, "I wanted to escape from reality," explaining why he kept moving around the country. At first, police arrested Junji on suspicion of abandoning a corpse. He told police, "There is no doubt that I hid my parents' bodies in the refrigerator I used to use." But while in custody, he quickly confessed to killing his father, admitting he strangled him with an electrical cord. He was rearrested for the murder of his father. Then, in mid-August, he was rearrested for the murder of his mother. "It was stressful to take care of parents with disabilities. I couldn't stand it," Junji stated, as an explanation for his crimes. The prosecutors asked for life imprisonment, saying that murdering 2 people was on a completely different scale, and the average problems arising from the fatigue of nursing care, and that there was no room for leniency. However, the defense argued that a sentence of around 23 years was appropriate, as the defendant's severe disability had an impact on the crime. By then, 60-year-old Junji Matsumoto was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison. Unfortunately, cases like these are growing in popularity, not only in Japan, but around the world. The pressures on mental health from external factors, like job loss, the aging population, not enough support structures for the elderly and vulnerable, as well as lack of connection with the community, have caused tragic outcomes for many. Whether Junji's isolation from society was caused by mental trauma from his childhood, or the added pressures of having to care for elderly parents became too much for him, he took the worst actions possible against his own parents. Rather than reaching out to the community or support groups in his area to help him care for his sick and senior parents, he decided to selfishly kill them, hide their remains, steal from them, and go on a trip across Japan. Hopefully, this story will send out a message to many people who are dealing with similar issues, and rather than running from their problems or dealing with them in a negative way, they will find alternatives that will ensure all human lives are cherished and cared for.
When I killed people, I had a desire to kill more. I don't care whether they deserve to live or not. It is none of my concern. A twisted serial killer slaughtered dozens of people simply because he was bitter about a breakup. Yang Zhenhai, China's most prolific serial killer, was born almost 55 years ago on July 29, 1968. But by the time he died, nearly 36 years on, he had gained the fearsome reputation as the monster killer. Although his murderous spree started in 1999, the turning point in Yang's life came earlier. Yang Zhenhai, the 4th of 6 children, grew up in poverty in Hunan province. Despite being praised for his intellect and sincerity, he struggled socially and academically, burdened by his family's poverty. His initial hopes in high school were dashed by financial constraints and bullying due to his small stature and family's lack of resources. Frustration with his circumstances led to conflict with his father, and in 1985, at the age of 17, he dropped out of school. Yang refused to return home and began his wanderings around China, working as a piece worker. 3 years later, he had his first trouble with the law and was sent to a work camp for having committed a series of thefts in Hebei province. In 1992, 24-year-old Yang Zhenhai met a girl and fell in love with her. But their tender happiness did not last long, as Yang was arrested for an attempted rape in his home village in 1996. His girlfriend claimed that whenever he was released, she would marry him. He ended up serving 3 years in prison. In 1999, following his release from prison, Yang found out that his now ex-girlfriend got married to someone else. Yang's girlfriend allegedly dumped him when she found out about his convictions for theft and attempted rape. Yang Zhenhai was incredibly frustrated with this situation. He believed his ex-girlfriend was wasting his time and planned to publicly humiliate him from the start. During this time, something happened in Yang's mind. A lonely and beaten Yang Zhenhai agonized with a growing hatred for people, and especially the women around him. His actions over the subsequent 4 years are thought to have been rooted in a desire to enact revenge on his ex-girlfriend and on society. Now 28 and full of hate, Yang Zhenhai looked for ways to vent his anger. In his eyes, the world treated him unfairly. He was impoverished, humiliated, and bullied as a child. Further, he was unable to make a decent living, and he was publicly humiliated by his ex. Eventually, crossing the line between common thug and murderer, Yang Zhenhai committed his first murders on September 19, 2000. The monster killer was born. Yang Zhenhai was entering an elderly couple's home in Hunan province when the elderly couple's dog began to bark. In his distress, Yang Zhenhai grabbed a brick and beat the elderly couple to death while they were sleeping. Yang Zhenhai fled the scene after grabbing some money. The guilt that tormented him was tremendous. He was not able to sleep for several days. The sound of skulls being shattered, the smell of blood that filled the air, and their dying gasps haunted him daily. A tormented Yang Zhenhai wandered the wilderness as if it was his home. He was able to survive as a nomad by stealing food from farms he came across. Yang Zhenhai eventually went for Anhui province after laying low for a while. His inner impulse to kill others, on the other hand, would become more difficult to resist. On October 1st, 2000, Yang Zhenhai disguised himself as a laborer and wandered around Zhaoyong village, watching a little girl and her younger brother play hide and seek. The monster waited till night to make these two children his first victims. Yang Zhenhai crept over the family's fence and into their home, where he beat their 63-year-old grandfather to death with an iron rod. Yang Zhenhai turned his attention to the children after the grandfather died, killing both of them. Yang Zhenhai raped the murdered 12-year-old girl after killing everyone in the house. The grandma discovered the family early the next morning. The monster had vanished by the time the cops arrived. Despite the fact that he had already killed 5 people, Yang Zhenhai did not turn himself in. Yang Zhenhai no longer felt sorry for his earlier crimes after fully embracing his inner demons. Indeed, his lack of regret was what drove him to perpetrate additional crimes. Killing had become a sport for him, and he felt amazing. Murder became a way for him to deal with his past traumas. Choosing to wander poor villages, Yang Zhenhai targeted people that reminded him of his childhood or previous relationships, poor elderly villagers and women. Between 1999 and 2003, Yang committed 67 murders and 23 rapes, all with the same modus operandi. His methods were extremely cruel, and he didn't leave any survivors. More than a few families were exterminated by his hand. Yang would sneak into family homes at night, typically targeting farmers, and butcher the occupants with improvised weapons ranging from axes to shovels. He'd also sexually assault the occupants he desired. Yang Zhenhai was almost forced to calm down after new murders in July 2002. SARS emerged in China around this period. Nonetheless, Yang was unconcerned. Zhenhai went on a rampage during the fall and winter months, committing most of his atrocities in a short period of time. The local police were put under intense pressure to locate and apprehend Yang Zhenhai. Around this time, major investigations were underway to track down the monster killer. Because several police agencies were cooperating, they began to suspect that these crimes were committed by the same person. This was difficult to prove because Yang was meticulous in his appearance. There was seldom any evidence left behind that would incriminate him outright. By the time of his arrest in November 2003, he was wanted in relation to homicides by authorities in 4 Chinese provinces. That said, he was essentially caught by accident. On November 2nd, the team investigating the monster killer received a tip. A guest in a hotel in Changzhou City was acting strangely. They walked aimlessly around the primary school near the hotel, and they didn't have an ID card to identify themselves. Police Director Liu Jian and 2 policemen pursued the suspect after determining that this was cause for investigation. It didn't take long for the suspect to notice the officers who were closely following him. Yang Zhenhai was caught while fleeing Liu Jian and his men. Further investigation found that he was also carrying a folding knife. With each passing moment, Yang Zhenhai became increasingly more suspicious to the officers. Eventually, the officers noticed Yang Zhenhai spoke with a Hunan accent, an accent that the monster killer would share. Detaining Yang Zhenhai, the officers brought him in for questioning. 3 days later, while waiting to question him, it was discovered that his blood sample matched the killer's blood sample exactly. As a result, the interrogation began soon after. After only 3 hours of interrogation, Yang Zhenhai could not answer questions coherently and stared at the ceilings for long periods of time with tears filling his eyes. Yet, after several rounds of interrogation, Yang Zhenhai finally admitted to the charges he was accused of. He smiled as he retold his murder and raping sprees. Yang Zhenhai admitted that killing was just exciting. 3 months later, on February 1st, 2004, the Intermediate People's Court sentenced Yang Zhenhai to death. With these heavy charges over his head, he rejected his right to appeal. 13 days later, on February 14th, he was taken to Luhai, Hunan, where he was executed by way of firing squad. After nearly 3 years of murdering people, the wandering monster killer was dead. According to some reports, Yang was driven to kill to take revenge against society, guilty of having negatively influenced his relationship with the girlfriend. Later, other newspapers declared that his actions were dictated by more macabre motives. Yang took a morbid pleasure in stealing, killing, and raping. Through this, Yang Zhenhai is the most prolific known Chinese serial killer since the country's founding. Killing 67 people, he has forever left his mark in a grievous way. Although Yang has never really expressed the motivations that drove him to kill, there is an emblematic statement of his that helps us to understand the reason for his extreme and heinous acts. "When I kill, I feel the desire to kill again. This drives me to kill. I don't care if my victims deserve to die or not. I don't give a damn. I have no desire to be part of society. Society is not my problem." This is the story of Kiyoshi Okubo, a man who went from pickup artist to rapist and serial killer. From a young age, he always blamed others for his lack of success. Whether it was school, work, or life, Okubo always raged against society, the police, and those in power by preying on the weak and vulnerable. He especially liked young, beautiful, and vulnerable women, not because he actually loved them, but because he wanted something to take his anger and frustration out on. In his life, he would end up assaulting over 150 women, raping a dozen, and killing 8. He would change his name, lie about his job, and lure women to their deaths. He was known as the Lust Killer, as he had an extreme sexual predatory history from a young age. What made him attack and rape girls? How did he get away with so many crimes without being stopped? Who were his victims? How was he finally caught? And what happened to him? Kiyoshi Okubo was born in the Gunma Prefecture of Japan on March 17, 1935. Born into a family of 8 children, he was a child of a Japanese father and half Japanese, half Russian mother. Okubo's father was known to have mistresses and would sometimes partake in sexual intercourse in front of his children. With a sexualized father, Okubo would often act out in school. In 6th grade, he took a 4-year-old girl to a wheat field and stuffed stones into her genitals. After the girl's parents found out, he denied he did it. Okubo's parents defended him and refused to apologize, saying it was just a game of doctors. In junior high school, Okubo seemed to be even more disruptive, unstable, and erratic. His parents tried to send him to another high school, but he was kicked out after 6 months because of his absences and the tuition not being paid. Giving up on schooling, Okubo decided to work at an electronics shop in Tokyo, but was fired when he was caught peeping at naked women in the public bathroom. Having failed various times at school, work, and business, and being rescued by his father many times, Okubo decided he would get by on an allowance provided by his parents. Instead of working, he decided to pretend to be a university student and pick up girls on the street. That is when Okubo's reign of terror started. At age 20 in July 1955, he called out to a 17-year-old girl and started a conversation. He was witty, charming, and was able to take the girl to a park bench where he overpowered her and sexually assaulted her. He was arrested for the rape and was given a suspended sentence and 3 years probation because it was his first offense. Despite his run-in with the law, he continued to approach women. In December of the same year, he saw another 17-year-old girl and offered to give her a ride on his motorcycle. When she agreed, he drove to a forested area and tried to sexually assault her. Luckily, she was able to get away. He was arrested and this time sent to prison for 3 to 5 years. Since Okubo had been a model prisoner and seemed to have been rehabilitated, he was released 6 months early for good behavior. Unfortunately, his good behavior did not last once out of prison. Just months after being released, in April of 1960, Okubo pretended to be an activist who was protesting anti-war efforts and was able to convince a 20-year-old college student to come to his home. Once there, he pinned her down and attempted to rape her, but his parents intervened and she escaped. His father paid her off, and she agreed to not press charges. In 1961, Okubo began dating a girl named Hiroko under a false identity. They married in 1962, had 2 children, and by then Okubo ran a milk shop. However, his attempt to blackmail a delivery boy for stealing milk bottles led to his arrest for attempted extortion in 1965. While in prison for the second time in his life, his wife discovered his criminal past, including rape and sexual assault. After being released, his business closed and Okubo reverted to his old ways. With the help of his father, Okubo was able to buy a car, nice clothes, and a new disguise. He decided to pretend to be a writer. In 1966, aged 31, he offered to drive a 16-year-old girl home. Once in the car, he drove to an embankment where he parked and sexually assaulted the girl. Then, just months later, he met a 20-year-old girl and drove her to a riverbank where he also raped her. She knew him, so when he let her go, she reported him to the police, and he was arrested. This time, he was sent to prison for 4 years and 6 months. Released early for good behavior in March of 1971, 36-year-old Okubo found his wife had left him and cut contact on his own brother's advice. Angered by his family's betrayal, he used money from his father to buy a Mazda, claiming it was for a furniture upholstery business. Instead, he acquired items to impersonate a painter, artist, or teacher. His resentment towards his family, police, society, and women intensified, escalating his crimes from sexual assault to murder. Less than a month after he was released, Okubo went on a murder spree in which he would kill at least 8 women in less than 2 months. The story of these heinous acts often began with seemingly innocent encounters. Okubo typically approached young women under false pretenses, often presenting himself as a teacher, artist, or other professional. He used this deception to gain their trust and initiate contact. He would meet women for drinks, share meals, or invite them to hotels, all the while spinning tales about his fictitious life. These meetings, under the guise of casual dates, were the first steps in a dance of deception. However, the mask would eventually slip. A moment of discovery would shatter the illusion. A request to see his driver's license, a mention of a family member in law enforcement. The victims, realizing the lie, would confront Okubo or threaten to expose him. For Okubo, this was the point of no return. Okubo's reaction to these revelations was immediate and brutal. The man who had been charming and persuasive transformed into a violent predator. Assaults, often sexual in nature, marked the terrifying turn of events. The final act of this macabre play was always murder, typically through strangulation, a chilling signature of Okubo's growing brutality. The disposal of the bodies was methodical and cold. Remote locations became the final resting places of his victims. Construction sites, riversides, shallow graves hastily dug in the dead of night. Each site was a testament to Okubo's meticulous planning and utter disregard for human life. As his crimes escalated, a pattern emerged. His method became more defined, his choices of locations for his heinous acts more specific. The psychological underpinnings of his crimes were complex, a mix of predatory behavior and a violent backlash against any threat of exposure. The mere mention of a connection to the police or the legal system by his victims seemed to ignite a particularly intense fury in Okubo. Despite this series of murders within a month, police struggled to link the crimes to Kiyoshi Okubo, even with reports of a cream-colored Mazda picking up women. It was on May 10, 1971, when a brother of one of the victims, refusing to wait for police inaction after her disappearance, initiated his own investigation. He learned from her friends about her meeting with a supposed painter. Finding her abandoned bike, he witnessed a man wiping it for fingerprints. After a brief encounter, he obtained the car's license plate and alerted the police, who traced it to Okubo. Despite visiting Okubo's home and ex-wife, they found no leads. On May 12th, a search party formed by the victim's friends and colleagues eventually located Okubo on May 13th. When apprehended by police, he was with another girl, casually telling her to take a taxi home. Okubo was finally arrested on May 14, 1971. Kiyoshi Okubo initially resisted cooperation with the police, taking 80 days of interrogation before confessing to his murders. Forensic experts matched over 200 hairs found in his car and on his clothes to the victims, using samples from the missing women's homes. Okubo's trial began on October 25, 1971, at Maebashi District Court. He pleaded guilty to all charges, including abduction, murder, and corpse abandonment, blaming his brutality on police mistreatment in previous cases. Convicted on February 22, 1973, Okubo received a death sentence, which was executed on January 22, 1976. This case was marked by numerous systemic failures. Okubo's parents seemingly enabled his behavior, repeatedly buying his freedom. The police were often a step behind, unable to connect the dots until Rieko's brother intervened, potentially saving more lives. The judicial system's leniency towards Okubo's early offenses, despite his repeated sexual crimes, was also criticized. Had those around Okubo, including acquaintances and former partners, reported his suspicious behavior, his capture might have occurred sooner. Okubo's manipulative tactics deceived numerous young women, luring them with promises of a glamorous lifestyle, only to brutally murder them. His notoriety as a ruthless killer of young women remains a dark chapter in Japan's history. When people hear the term serial killer, they don't often think of Japan. Japan is mostly known around the world as the place that houses delicious food, beautiful landscapes, and traditional culture. But there is also a dark side to Japan. Japan has been the home of some bizarre and brutal crimes, including bloody massacres, large-scale poison attacks, and of course, violent serial murders. A lot of these tragedies aren't as widely reported in the Western world as they are in Asia. So here is the story of 11 Japanese serial killers and where they are today. Number 1. Tsutomu Miyazaki. Tsutomu Miyazaki might be the most infamous serial killer in Japanese history, and for good reason. His crimes are the stuff of nightmares, and he single-handedly changed perceptions of otaku culture for the worse. Known as the little girl murderer, as a youngster, he was born with a severe wrist deformity which affected his confidence and his ability to make friends. Although he was born to a wealthy family, his parents were emotionally distant. He grew up as a recluse and suffered various mental health problems. In 1988, he made his first foray into murder. His first victim was a 4-year-old girl who he lured into his car as they drove away into a secluded area. He strangled her and dumped the body. Only a few weeks later, fueled by the desire to feel the same thrill, Miyazaki kidnapped and murdered another little girl with the same modus operandi. As his fantasies grew, his murders progressed in brutality. He killed twice more in the same manner, but with his final victim, he dismembered her in his home and ate parts of her torso. He also took pictures of his victims, defiled their dead bodies, and sent body parts and letters to the grieving families. Miyazaki was finally caught in 1989 when he was discovered naked in his car with his would-be 5th victim. He was sentenced to death and hanged in 2007. Number 2. Takahiro Shiraishi. The crimes of Takahiro Shiraishi have only recently come to light, and this man certainly belongs on the list of the most vicious serial killers in history. Takahiro Shiraishi used modern technology and social media to target his victims. Known as the Twitter killer, Takahiro used Twitter to lure vulnerable and depressed girls to him. Despite having a normal childhood, he distanced himself from his family and began working in the sex industry, luring women into prostitution in Tokyo's red light district. This experience taught him how to manipulate women and gain their confidence, a tactic he later used in his murders. Originally using the site to recruit girls into prostitution, after being caught and arrested, he decided to use the app to instead recruit girls who were sad, depressed, and suicidal. In 2017, Shiraishi used Twitter to find women with suicidal tendencies. Claiming to be a fellow person having suicidal thoughts, he would offer girls advice on how to best kill themselves and offered suicide pacts where they could come to his home and commit the act together. But after they arrived, Shiraishi strangled them, then dismembered their bodies. A family member of one of the victims followed her online trail, leading him to Shiraishi, who went by the moniker Hanging Pro. Killing girls from age 15 to women up to 26 years old, he took their money, killed them, dismembered their bodies, and tried to dispose of them. When the police arrived at his door, he welcomed them in and showed them the boxes of bones, skulls, and even decomposing body parts covered in kitty litter to help diffuse the smell. The police discovered the mutilated bodies of 8 different women and 1 man. Shiraishi's death sentence was finalized in January 2021, and he is currently awaiting execution. Number 3. Yukio Yamaji. Yukio Yamaji had a difficult upbringing, being raised in poverty by his mother after his father died when he was 11 years old. Struggling financially, Yukio also struggled in school and was often quiet with odd bursts of violence or fits of rage. He dropped out after junior high school and started working. He also started seeing a woman much older than him. When his mother didn't approve of the relationship, he beat her with a bat and killed her. With her bloody corpse still on the floor, he invited the girl he was seeing for dinner. Shocked and petrified, she fled and called the police. Due to his age and difficult family situation, he was sent to juvenile detention. He stated that his motivation for murder was his mother's debt and that she'd interfered in his relationships. Obviously suffering from mental illness, he was sent to a mental hospital but was released after 3 years as he was believed to be reformed. Unfortunately, at age 19, with no parents, out on his own, he resorted to working odd jobs, stealing from Japanese slot machine centers and searching for the woman he had been dating before he killed his mother. Unable to find her, he found 2 sisters who lived in the same building block as him. He would later tell police that one of the sisters reminded him of the girl he used to date. Stalking the sisters, finding out which unit they lived in and their schedule, he waited for one and ambushed her. He raped and killed her, and then her sister as well. He then set fire to their home to cover his tracks and left. However, he was soon suspected by the police as he had recently moved into the same building. When interrogated, Yamaji immediately confessed. He also shared the unsettling detail that he was extremely aroused and climaxed while killing both his mother and the sisters. Eventually, he was charged with their murders, but this time the judge wouldn't be as lenient as the first time. Despite undergoing a psychological evaluation that revealed he suffered from Asperger's syndrome, Yamaji received the death penalty in 2009. Number 4. Miyuki Ishikawa. Nothing screams serial killer like having murdered over 100 children. There aren't many women serial killers, but Miyuki Ishikawa was a midwife at a maternity hospital in Kotobuki, where many infants were abandoned due to the poor financial situation of their parents. Ishikawa, frustrated by the lack of resources to look after the abandoned babies, decided to take matters into her own hands. Under her care, many children died of starvation or suffocation due to her neglect. She even tried to get money from the parents for the murders, claiming that the price for their death is less than what it would have cost to raise them. In 1948, police discovered the bodies of 5 infants, and their autopsies concluded that they hadn't died of natural causes. An investigation pointed to Ishikawa and her accomplices, her husband and another doctor, and the 3 were arrested. The exact number of babies which Ishikawa murdered is unknown, but police discovered over 40 bodies in the office of a local mortician and another 30 in a nearby temple, 2 places Ishikawa used as dumping grounds. Strangely, Ishikawa was only sentenced to 8 years in prison, as authorities considered the homicides as crimes by omission rather than intentional. After an appeal, the sentence was reduced to only 4 years. After she got released, Miyuki Ishikawa became active in real estate. On May 30th, 1987, she died at the age of 90. Number 5. Futoshi Matsunaga. Futoshi Matsunaga can be considered one of the more recent Japanese serial killers, as most of his crimes happened in the late 90s. The exact number of his victims is unknown, as no remains were ever found. However, Matsunaga is infamous for being a particularly disturbed killer, as he would kidnap multiple victims at a time and force them to torture each other. Matsunaga's first victim was a man who he initially tried to blackmail, but then abducted him and his daughter and held them in his apartment. Matsunaga electrocuted the man and forced him to eat his own feces. After he died, he convinced the daughter that it was she who had murdered him. Matsunaga was aided by his accomplice, Junko Ogata, who was also his mistress. Although Ogata helped Matsunaga in committing the crimes, he was abusive and manipulative towards her. Matsunaga's other victims were 5 members of Ogata's family who had been living with Matsunaga and Ogata at the time. Matsunaga bound them and held them captive, then gradually killed them one by one, even coercing a 10-year-old girl to hold down her mother while her father strangled her. Once all 5 were dead, Matsunaga chopped up their bodies, boiled, then discarded them. Everything came to an end in March 2002 when Matsunaga's final kidnapped victim escaped and contacted the police. They arrested the pair, and although Matsunaga claimed he was innocent, Junko confessed to everything. This led to a conviction for both of them, a life sentence for Ogata and a death sentence for Matsunaga. Ogata is currently still serving her sentence while Matsunaga awaits his execution. Number 6. Seisaku Nakamura. Seisaku Nakamura, known as the Hamamatsu Death Killer, was one of Japan's youngest serial murderers and was responsible for the stabbings of 9 people. Born in 1924, Nakamura was born deaf, but he was a highly intelligent child. Although from a young age he displayed psychopathic tendencies, such as a lack of compassion or empathy. This behavior, along with the cold treatment he received from his family, contributed to him turning violent and committing murders at a very early age. His first victims were 2 women who Nakamura tried to rape, but ended up killing as they resisted his advances. In 1941, at age 17, he recklessly assaulted 2 women in a geisha store, killing one of them. Only 2 days later, Nakamura impulsively stabbed 3 more people in a restaurant, fatally wounding all of them. Soon after, he directed his anger towards his family. During a heated argument, Nakamura stabbed his brother to death and seriously injured 5 other members of the household, including his parents and his nephews. However, the victims never informed the police who the perpetrator was, for fear of retaliation from the disturbed teenager. Nakamura's final victims were another family whom he followed home in August the same year. He killed both parents and 2 of their children, but the oldest daughter survived and was able to later identify Nakamura. He was apprehended after a few months, and due to pressure from the public, he was quickly tried and convicted shortly after. He was executed at age 19. Number 7. Kiyoshi Okubo. Born in 1935, Kiyoshi Okubo was a Japanese serial killer who went on to rape and murder 8 women. Okubo was a quarter Russian from his mother's side and often found himself teased at school because of his ethnic features. Although he came from a large family with 8 children, Okubo was still showered with affection, especially by his mother, who had a hard time enforcing any discipline on him. Due to the lack of authority in his family, he began to rebel at school, disrespecting teachers but also his female colleagues. Okubo showed disturbing behavior from a young age, and when he was around 11 years old, he sexually assaulted a young girl by forcing stones up her genitals. A few years later, he attempted his first rape, but was caught and imprisoned for 4 years. In 1961, Okubo married a woman who was unaware of his criminal record and had 2 children with her, but he continued to be on the lookout for more rape victims. In 1971, he transitioned to murder and killed 8 women over a span of 2 months, all of whom were strangled. Only a few days after his murders finished, Okubo was caught and confessed everything. He tried to blame his acts on his treatment received while in prison from his previous crimes, claiming it made him want to rebel against authority. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging in 1973. Number 8. Genzo Kurita. Genzo Kurita was one of Japan's first serial killers and was active after World War II when Japan was still recovering from the war and reforming. In a time of poverty, crime, and instability, Genzo was a bully who took advantage of the weak and preyed on the innocent. His murder spree lasted 4 years, from 1948 to 1952, during which he claimed the lives of 8 people. As a young adult, Kurita started to have problems with the law and was arrested a couple of times for burglary and assault. In 1948, Kurita committed his first murder, killing one of the girls he was dating at the time, as she continually pressured him to get married. Later, he went on and killed another one of his girlfriends. Kurita was not convicted for his first murders, so after a few years in 1951, he regained his confidence and killed again. This time, it was a young woman in Koyama who he murdered and raped right next to her sleeping baby, who he left unharmed. Shortly after, his deadly desires took over again, leading him to rape and kill a 29-year-old woman who he threw off a cliff. More brutally, Kurita also threw her 3 young children along with her. Fortunately, the eldest daughter survived the incident. Kurita's final murders were committed in January 1952 when he killed an elderly woman and her young niece. Once again, he raped her corpse, but this time he left fingerprints at the scene, which police quickly identified, and he was arrested only a few days later. Kurita received the death sentence, which he appealed, but due to his unstable mental condition, he retracted the appeal and he was executed in 1959. Number 9. Akira Nishiguchi. Akira Nishiguchi was born in Osaka in 1925 and began his criminal career as a fraudster before turning his hand to serial murder. Nishiguchi found himself on Japan's most wanted list after murdering 2 men that he first defrauded. While the police worked tirelessly to catch him, he went into hiding in a hotel in Hamamatsu for 5 days following his first killings. There, he killed the owner of the establishment along with her mother. After vacating the hotel, he went to murder an elderly gentleman working as a lawyer in Tokyo. The police's efforts to catch Nishiguchi paid off when an 11-year-old girl recognized him and informed the authorities. He was caught and sentenced to death by hanging. He died on the 11th of December 1970 at the age of 45. Number 10. Masumi Hayashi, the Curry Killer. Masumi Hayashi was a 37-year-old woman with 4 children who lived with her husband in a small town in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. A former insurance agent, she had some run-ins with the law when she and her husband, who was an exterminator, were caught in some insurance fraud. She also wasn't very much liked in her neighborhood, as she was distant, had the biggest house, the most expensive car, and seemed to turn her nose up at her neighbors. In small towns where women in the neighborhood are tightly knit and take part in many community events, Masumi might have felt the outcast. Rather than try to be nice or altogether ignore the locals, instead, she decided to poison the inhabitants of the town during a festival. In 1998, she laced a pot of curry with arsenic, which was sold at the festival, and ended up poisoning 67 people. Of those, 2 adults and 2 children were killed. For this, Hayashi received the death penalty, which she has unsuccessfully appealed several times. Currently, therefore, she is still awaiting her execution. Number 11. Kayotaka Katsuta. Kayotaka Katsuta, a firefighter from Kyoto, was a serial killer who killed up to 22 people, though he was only charged with 8 murders throughout the 70s and 80s. Although he was the son of a farmer, in his youth he was always getting in trouble for various things, such as theft of handbags, stealing cars, and vandalizing public property. Despite his criminal history, he was able to get into the firefighter program and worked his way until he was quite high up in the ranks of the firefighting service in his town. But his new career was not enough to keep him busy, as he was living a luxurious life with jewelry, cars, and expensive housing, as well as a mistress on the side. To keep his wealth, he would target hostesses. Hostesses are young women who work at hostess clubs and serve drinks to rich businessmen. They drink and flirt and get paid lots of money to entertain men. Kayotaka would follow these women after they left work and sexually assault, rob, and kill them. He even attacked a police officer and stole his gun, which he would use to kill his future victims. It would be years before eventually the law caught up with him. Katsuta was executed at the Nagoya Detention House on November 30th, 2000. On June 13, 1981, in Paris, a couple witnesses a small Asian man exiting a taxi with 2 large, heavy bags. The man attempts to hide the bags under bushes near a lake when he notices the couple watching. Curious, the couple moves closer to investigate the concealed bags. Once they open the first bag, they are in for a shock. Inside is the bloody, mutilated torso of a woman. This is the story of Issei Sagawa, the man who ate a woman and got away with it. From the outside looking in, Issei Sagawa appeared to be a man of opportunity and intellect. Born on April 26, 1949, in the affluent city of Kobe, Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, Sagawa was the offspring of considerable wealth and influence. His father, a prominent businessman, and his grandfather, an esteemed editor. However, Sagawa's premature birth and subsequent health complications seemed to cast a shadow over his life, one that darkened with each passing year. Despite overcoming his early health struggles, Sagawa developed into a man fixated on the grotesque. In the innocent setting of a classroom, while his peers were oblivious to his inner turmoil, young Sagawa was silently nurturing a cannibalistic desire that was sparked by the mere sight of a classmate's thigh. This fixation followed him into adulthood, transforming from a silent specter into a violent reality. The first time he attempted to bring his fantasy to life was when he was a 24-year-old student at Waco University in Tokyo. There was a blonde German woman who lived nearby, and Sagawa became obsessed with her, stalking her until he found out where she lived. Then, one night, he broke into her apartment with the plan of hitting her over the head to knock her out. He believed he could then eat some of her flesh without killing her. However, as he was breaking in, he awakened the woman, who immediately began screaming. The police came right away and arrested Sagawa for attempted rape. Sagawa did not tell them his real intentions. This incident, brushed under the rug with a monetary settlement by his father, was a prelude to the horror that would later unfold in Paris. Sagawa's relocation to France, under the guise of furthering his education, was a mere cover for his sinister aspirations. The Sorbonne became his hunting ground, where he preyed upon the unsuspecting female students. Surrounded by so many beautiful young women, his cannibalistic urges grew harder to resist. While in Paris, he says that he had tried to kill several prostitutes in order to eat them, but simply couldn't pull the trigger. Renee Hartveld was a 25-year-old Dutch woman who met Issei during their studies in Paris. Seemingly developing some rapport with one another, Sagawa felt comfortable enough to invite her to dinner at his apartment to translate poetry for a school assignment, and Renee obliged. However, little did she know that Issei had different plans. As much as he wanted to consume Hartveld, he says, he didn't want to have to kill her. She had actually been a good friend to him, perhaps the only friend he had ever had. But his compulsion was too strong to resist. It didn't take long after Renee arrived that Sagawa killed her. Sagawa shot her in the back of the neck with a rifle. Because of the shock of the shot, he fainted, but once regaining consciousness, Sagawa resumed committing necrophilia with her corpse. He tried biting into her flesh, but could not. So he purchased a butcher knife to continue cutting her up, cooking parts of her body and eating them both raw and cooked. This must sound rich coming from me, but the moment the girl became a corpse, I realized that I had lost an important friend and even regretted killing her for a moment. What I truly wished was to eat her living flesh. Nobody believes me.
買ってきて、その中に入れるんですけど、そんなに簡単に入るもんじゃない。特に胴体っていうのはものすごく重いし、まず切るのも大変でした。
But my ultimate intention was to eat her, not necessarily kill her, Sagawa later said in an interview. After consuming various parts of her and taking photos of her corpse, Sagawa dismembered her body and placed them into 2 separate suitcases. This is when he left for the lake, where he was soon caught. The couple who had seen Sagawa called the police after opening the first suitcase, but Sagawa had vanished before police arrived. Police found out that one bag contained her torso and that Renee's head and limbs were in the other bag. Clearly, the then unknown tiny Asian man was trying to dump the evidence of his crime in the lake and panicked when he saw he was being watched. The victim's remains were taken in for an autopsy. Once on the table, her body told the story of a grisly crime. The woman had suffered a gunshot wound to her neck, which was the cause of her death. But that wasn't all. Her body was mutilated extensively, with large pieces of her legs, breasts, and buttocks cut away. An exam would reveal that someone had had sex with her corpse over the course of about 2 days. Police traced the taxi driver who had transported a man from a luxury apartment on Rue Erlanger in Paris's affluent Auteuil district. The driver recounted jokingly, questioning if the heavy bags he loaded contained a body, to which the man replied they were books. Investigation into the apartment's residence revealed a single Asian man fitting the witness description, 32-year-old Issei Sagawa, a Japanese literature student at the Sorbonne. Only 48 hours after his botched attempt to dump the body, Sagawa was arrested at his apartment. On his table, police found a partially eaten meal of vegetables and human flesh. Inside his refrigerator, they found more pieces of human flesh, carefully wrapped so as to be eaten later. Under questioning, Sagawa confessed readily. The victim's name, he told police, is Renee Hartveld. a Dutch classmate of his at the Sorbonne. He had been attracted to her for some time, he told them, and he would get aroused just thinking about eating her flesh, especially her buttocks. He killed her, he confessed, solely in order to eat her. He told police that he had attempted to kill her a few times before, but had chickened out at the last minute. This time, he had steeled himself, vowing to follow through with his twisted plan. Knowing Hartvelt was fluent in German, he invited her over to his apartment by asking her to read a German poem about cannibalism so that he could record it for a class. Sagawa said that while she was reading the poem, with her back turned to him, he aimed his .22 rifle at her neck and pulled the trigger. There was no doubt that Sagawa was guilty of murdering Hartvelt. However, because the French would not try a person who is ruled insane, Sagawa was sent for a pre-trial psychiatric exam. His exam revealed a twisted pathology going back decades. Sagawa told the court psychiatrist that he first began to fantasize about cannibalizing women around the age of 11. When he was attracted to a woman, always tall, blonde white women, he would also get hungry for the taste of her flesh, particularly her thighs. He said this urge to eat the object of his desire was the ultimate expression of love, of wanting to consume them and make them a part of him. As time went on, the compulsion just seemed to grow within him. He explained that he never wanted to kill anyone, only to eat them. After their exams, the French court psychiatrist concluded that Sagawa was indeed insane, a sexual psychopath, and therefore unfit to stand trial. He was sent to an asylum for the criminally insane, where he was to be confined indefinitely. Sagawa did not take his sentence well. As a well-educated man from a wealthy family, he felt he did not belong with the other patients who were, as he put it, deranged, and would have preferred prison to the insane asylum. But he made good use of his time, writing and illustrating a semi-autobiographical book as a form of therapy. Thanks to the infamy he gained because of his gruesome crime, he was approached by an author from Japan named Inihiko Yamota. Yamota convinced Sagawa to let him publish a copy of Sagawa's own book. The book, which included graphic details of the murder and cannibalizing of Hartvelt, became a bestseller in Japan, and Sagawa's infamy transformed into fame. Then, in 1984, Sagawa's father came to his rescue and provided his son with an influential attorney to ensure his return to Japan, capitalizing on the French public's unhappiness with having to support a criminal like Sagawa. The attorney convinced the French government to deport him back to Japan. Sagawa arrived in a media frenzy. However, he could grant no interviews yet. He was immediately taken by ambulance to Matsuzawa Hospital. What the French government and the public at large didn't know was that Sagawa was only admitted to Matsuzawa Hospital voluntarily. The ambulance and appearance of being taken into custody was little more than a press stunt designed to cover for the fact that Sagawa was now a free man. Because he had been declared insane, the charges against him in France were sealed, so none of the paperwork could be released to Japanese authorities. Without the French case files, Japan had nothing to charge him with. After 15 months at Matsuzawa, Sagawa, a confessed murderer, cannibal, and necrophile, checked himself out and walked free. After his release, the Japanese media treated Sagawa as a kind of eccentric celebrity. He was interviewed on numerous TV shows and magazines, where he spoke calmly about his crimes, describing in detail how he killed and cannibalized Hartvelt. He has been a guest commentator on TV shows, has appeared on game shows and cooking shows, and even worked as a freelance food critic. He has also starred in several adult films where he bites his co-stars. For a time, he was able to support himself with the royalties and fees for media appearances, along with a hefty inheritance after his parents died. However, once his inheritance and public interest dried up, he was forced to live in public housing and draw welfare benefits. By 2013, his health was failing. He was diagnosed with diabetes and suffered 2 heart attacks. He died of pneumonia in 2022, and his funeral was attended only by his family. In what is perhaps a small bit of poetic justice, shortly before his death, Sagawa had to undergo a gastronomy and could only eat through a feeding tube. On Halloween morning 2017, as the world awoke to festivities and jack-o'-lanterns, the police discovered what could only be described as a real-life house of horrors, a scene straight out of a nightmare belonging to the notorious Japanese serial killer Takahiro Shiraishi. 9 dismembered bodies were stacked up in boxes with more than 240 bones concealed in coolers and toolboxes, sprinkled with cat litter in order to hide the evidence. How did the person who was once so silent become a serial killer? Takahiro Shiraishi was born in Zama, Japan on October 9, 1990. He grew up in Zama along with his parents and younger sister. People who lived in the neighborhood remembered the young Shiraishi as a quiet child who was able to socialize with neighbors. At school, his grades were far from stellar, but he was an attentive pupil who didn't especially stand out, but was not a gloomy character either. One person claiming to be a former schoolmate took to Twitter saying he was so normal, inconspicuous, and low profile that most classmates would not even recognize him when news of his alleged crimes broke. But the warning signs were perhaps already there, as one elementary school contemporary told the private Fuji TV network that Shiraishi and his friends enjoyed choking each other for fun. Although as lurid as that sounds, it wasn't until years later that things really started to go down. After graduating from high school in 2009, Shiraishi began to work as a scout for sex parlors in Kabukicho, Tokyo's biggest red light district, seeking to lure young women into working in the clubs there. His forceful recruitment practices earned him the title of a creepy person whose image spread virally on the internet, the post informing others that he was someone in the area to avoid. In February 2011, he was arrested and eventually handed a suspended jail sentence for recruiting a young woman for a sex shop in the full knowledge that she would be forced into prostitution. Craving love, but jobless and unwilling to put in the hard work, he cocooned himself in social media, where he got deeply involved in the dark side of it. In June 2017, he confessed to his father he suffered from depression and would urgently like to have his own space. Shiraishi was close to his father and frequently helped him out at work. Eventually, his father decided to help Shiraishi out and acted as guarantor. On August 22, 2017, Shiraishi moved into the 140 square feet apartment which Japanese media would later go on to describe as the House of Horrors. Shiraishi, by this time, had already created 2 accounts on Twitter with a small followers base. The 2 accounts were I Want to Die and Hangman. Under the first account, he projected himself as a disconsolate victim seeking a company for his misery. Under the second account, he projected himself as a person proficient at helping people die. I want to spread my knowledge in hanging. I really want to become the source of strength for everyone who is in pain. If you are at a dead end, please consult me, he tweeted. His plan worked, and he found a woman whom he convinced to start a relationship with him. But the veneer of a happy life soon faded, and jealousy reared its ugly head when she grew close to a male friend. He knocked her unconscious and, filled with uncontrollable lust, raped her. But it came to his mind that she would report the sexual assault if she went home alive, and he would then be thrown into jail. Ultimately, he decided it would be best if he killed her. Surprised he didn't get caught for his actions, he went on to search for new victims using the hashtag suicide recruitment on Twitter, preying on young girls who wanted to take their own lives. He told them via direct messaging on Twitter, "Let's die together." He said he gave them alcohol, tranquilizers, and sleeping pills to make them relax before assaulting them. Preferring to kill by strangulation, Shiraishi fostered his long-time obsession with choking, suicide, and death. While Shiraishi had mainly used 2 social media accounts, I Want to Die and Hangman, these were among 6 handles that he used to interact with 37 different accounts over 3 months. Altogether, he met 13 people, killing 9 of them in a time span of only 3 months. It would soon become apparent that his 9th victim ironically ended him. This victim had just lost her mother when she began talking to Shiraishi online. She posted that she was looking for someone who wanted to die with her. The victim's brother, fearing the worst when she went missing, hacked into his sister's Twitter account where he discovered the conversations between the 2 individuals. Using the help of another woman who claimed to almost fall into Shiraishi's trap herself, they hatched a plan with the police to catch him. The woman agreed to be the bait to lure Shiraishi out for the police, who then followed him home on October 30th. When the police showed up at the apartment, they asked him where the missing 23-year-old woman was. "In there," Shiraishi said, pointing to one of his many containers abundant with human remains. In his apartment, the police discovered 9 deceased bodies, all of which had been dismembered. His victims' heads, legs, and limbs were divided among 3 cooler boxes and 5 huge storage crates. Shortly after being taken into custody, Shiraishi confessed to killing 1 person in August, 4 in September, and 4 in October, mostly on the same day he met them. 8 of the 9 victims were women, mainly in their late teens to early 20s. Shiraishi killed his only male victim after he confronted Shiraishi about the whereabouts of his girlfriend, who happened to be Shiraishi's first victim. Shiraishi told police he initially found it difficult to get rid of a body. In fact, it took him 3 days to get rid of the first body. After that, he dealt with the bodies within 1 day. He said his motives had been sex and money. He is alleged to have choked his victims, whose real names and ages he did not know until they passed out, before sexually assaulting some of them. Shiraishi even confessed to slicing up the bodies in his bathroom in an attempt to destroy the evidence of his gruesome deeds. He told the police he disposed of his victims' flesh and internal organs like garbage, but kept their bones out of fear he would get caught. Police eventually recovered 2 kitchen knives, scissors, a saw, binding rope, and a gimlet, all with traces of blood on them. His neighbors in the 2-story, 12-unit apartment block said they had neither seen nor heard anything amiss, despite complaints of a persistent pungent smell emanating from his apartment. One of them pointed out that it was strange that his bathroom ventilation fan was kept on at all times. Shiraishi even brazenly used the neighborhood garbage collection point to dispose of the evidence. A neighbor has noted, in hindsight, his frequent trips to the chute. During his trial in 2020, Shiraishi's lawyers argued his charges should be changed to the lesser offense of homicide with consent. They said his victims apparently gave consent to be killed, according to the messages that were sent. Shiraishi denied this himself and confirmed that none of the victims eventually wanted to get killed, although he had promised them a guaranteed way to die or that he would join them in mutual suicide. Shiraishi bruised the back of their heads deliberately so they could not resist. Ultimately, it is apparent that Shiraishi never actually had suicidal thoughts of his own. He simply chose people he deemed easy to prey on financially and sexually. But when they wanted to talk about their feelings rather than die, Shiraishi ended their lives for them. When asked about what he did, Shiraishi said, "It was a very comfortable and pleasurable life. I failed because I was caught. I have no other feelings." On December 15th, 2020, Shiraishi was found guilty and sentenced to death. After the verdict, his defense team launched an appeal for the ruling, despite the murderer himself being against the idea. Eventually, Shiraishi's death sentence was executed in January 2021. In response to the crimes, Japan expanded its suicide support lines to help their struggling citizens, with the rates increasing exponentially due to the global pandemic. Japan is often portrayed as a pressure cooker, isolationist society with high suicide rates, and suicide remains the top cause of death for those aged 39 and below. Following the case, Twitter introduced warnings and links to support groups and charities anytime words related to suicide or self-harm are searched in Japan. With every shocking case like Shiraishi's comes calls for tighter regulations and more scrutiny over social media and the dark web, though there are limits to what can be done. They are devils who have no human heart, so I only want a death sentence. That's why I'll do whatever I can. This is what the mother of Rie Isogai said about the people that brutally murdered her daughter in 2004. Using the dark web, they planned their terrible crime. This is the story of the kidnapping, theft, and murder of Rie Isogai, who fought until the end and left her murderers with a surprise that they would never forget. In 2007, there was a private underground site on the dark web called Dark Employment Security Office. This was an underground bulletin board site that many people used to discuss, recruit, and plan for crimes. On August 17, 2007, from the intimidating depths of the dark web, an ominous message appeared. The message read, "I'm out of prison and living in my van. I'm looking for a partner in crime. Would anyone like to work with me?" It was Kenji Kawagishi, a 40-year-old unemployed man who posted this message. It was this message that led to the meeting up of 3 strangers to carry out a plan which ended in the death of Rie Isogai. Kenji Kawagishi, also known as Kenji, wasn't your usual upright citizen. He was bullied as a child and eventually turned into a criminal. After a few minor convictions, he eventually started using the dark web in August 1999 to buy, open, and sell bank accounts so they could be used for fraud. Even while this gave his family additional money, his spending habits quickly outpaced this additional revenue, and by 2002, tax evasion and unpaid mortgage payments had finally resulted in the seizure of his flat. After this, Kenji spent several years in and out of jail due to fraud convictions. He kept using the dark web in spite of these accusations. In 2007, he had recently been released from prison for yet another round of fraudulent conduct when he posted his statement on the dark web. Two men replied and were interested to meet up and try to rob people. Like Kenji, Tsukasa Kanda was 36 years old and had a difficult past. Tsukasa was mistreated by his father, bullied at school, and suffered from persistent migraines. Because of this unstable and dangerous environment, he joined neighborhood gangs and committed small-time crimes. By the time Kenji posted the message to the dark web, Tsukasa's financial situation was miserable and he was in deep debt. Because he earned so little, he depended on the weekly allowance he received from his girlfriend, but he could no longer put up with this. He was desperately looking for a way out of it. That's why, after being found guilty of fraud in 1997, he started using the dark web. Yoshitomo Hori, a 32-year-old dart player, replied to the message as well. Like Tsukasa, Yoshitomo was in deep debt. He owed more than 4 million yen, the equivalent of $30,000, even though he had no past criminal record. On August 21, 2007, the three got together at Yoshitomo's house. It was at this point that they started to devise a cunning plan to profit. A number of schemes, including pickpocketing, kidnapping, and even a theft against a pachinko parlor, a Japanese casino, were included in their drafts. At first, they met with only the plan of robbing others. After multiple robbery attempts failed, the three men then met in a parking lot to think of a new way to get money. It seems that the three men were failing in their objectives, and with that came despair and dissatisfaction. That's when Kanda recommended abducting a woman and forcing her to give them her money. Hori and Kawagishi liked the plan, as it would be easy for three men to overpower a woman. Sadly, after they upped their ante, the devious plans would have some extremely terrifying repercussions the very following day. It was the evening of August 24, 2007, and like any other day, Rie Isugai tried to call her boyfriend as she was walking home from work. Usually, these calls made her feel safe in the big city. Unfortunately, her boyfriend didn't pick up the phone. This turned out to be her last call to anyone. Because on that same evening, the three men drove around the area looking for women who were walking alone. They drove around for almost 3 hours before they spotted Rie around 10 p.m. She was just 100 meters or about 300 feet from her home when they approached. As she was walking, Hori got out of the van and approached her, asking for directions. When she stopped to help, the three men forced her into the van. Once inside the van, they handcuffed her and threatened her with knives, demanding she give them her money and ATM card. Kawagishi drove his van to a parking lot in the outer areas of Nagoya, where it was much quieter and no one was around to hear her scream. At first, Rie refused to give up her ATM code, but after continuous threats and beatings, Rie told the three men her PIN was 2960. Once they had her PIN, Kawagishi tried to sexually assault Rie, but the other two intervened. During the confrontation, Rie tried to escape the van, but the men managed to prevent her from escaping. Kanda placed a bag over her head and wrapped packing tape around her head to smother her. Finding it was taking too long, he took a hammer and started hitting her over the head, while the other two, Hori and Kawagishi, started choking her with a rope. The blows from the hammer and the strangling with the rope ultimately proved fatal to Rie. After Rie had died, they drove to a forested area in Gifu Prefecture and dumped her body around 4 a.m. on the 25th of August. They split the money they found in her purse, but this converted to only $600 and was not nearly enough for the three greedy men. Therefore, they decided to drive straight to an ATM to raid Rie's bank account. This is where they found out that the PIN given to them by the now deceased Rie did not work. The numbers Rie had passed on to the men turned out to be a well-thought-out move with a hint to a number game Rie was obsessed with. In this game, numbers represent words, and in Japanese, the number 2960 reads Ni ku mu wa, which means I hate you. Until her dying moment, she had refused to give anything to the men and foiled their robbery attempt. Disappointed that their robbery had yielded far less than hoped, the three men decided to meet again the next evening to rob other women. But before the time came, Kawagishi could no longer live with his guilt. He called the police and confessed to everything they had done that night. He described the crime in detail and told the police where to find Rie's body. In Japan, the death penalty is waived if a criminal surrenders to police before being identified as a suspect. This was Kawagishi's biggest motivation. Using the information from Kawagishi, the police found Rie's body. Shortly after Rie's mother identified her daughter's lifeless body, the police were able to track down the remaining two men. All three men were arrested and charged with robbery, murder, kidnapping, confinement, and abandonment of a corpse. Kawagishi was also charged with attempted rape. Before the trial even began, Rie's mother started a petition asking for the death penalty for all three men. This petition ended up getting over 300,000 signatures. Usually, in single murder cases, the death penalty is not sought, but because of the petition, growing support by Japanese people for capital punishment, and the case's connection with the dark web, prosecutors asked for the death penalty. Even the fathers of Kanda and Kawagishi asked the court to sentence their sons to death. The trial began in September 2008. All three pled guilty to robbing and murdering Rie Isugai. However, during the trial, each defendant blamed the other for being the mastermind and coming up with the idea to murder Rie. Kawagishi told the court that Kanda was the leader and had originally planned to kill Rie. Hori also claimed Kanda was the leader, and until Kanda started suffocating Rie, he had not intended to kill the victim. Kanda claimed all three had agreed to search for a woman, rob her, and then kill her from the get-go. In the closing arguments, the prosecutors demanded the death penalty for all three, including Kawagishi, despite his confession. Claiming he showed little remorse for the murder and only confessed to lessen his sentence, he deserved the same punishment as the others. But the defense claimed that without Kawagishi telling police where Rie's body was and who the other two culprits were, the case might never have been solved. Finally, on March 18, 2009, all three were found guilty of the murder of Rie Isugai. Kanda and Hori were sentenced to death. Kawagishi, however, was sentenced to life in prison. Kanda's lawyer appealed the decision, but Kanda withdrew the appeal and was executed in June of 2015. Hori also appealed to the High Court of Nagoya, and in April of 2011, his sentence was reduced to life in prison, as the court found that both Kawagishi and Hori were being led by Kanda. In a surprising turn of events, it was found that Hori had actually robbed and killed a couple in 1998 and was once again sentenced to death. His death sentence was finalized in July of 2019.